Hello there, Year 10 historians. Today we're going to have another skills lesson and we're going to be talking about analysing texts, and in particular we're going to be looking at a speech from Eddie Mabo. Let's do that. Okay, our learning goals today are: you're going to know the questions to ask yourself when analysing a text, you're going to know the skills involved in analysing a text, and I hope you'll be able to better analyse a text. Right, so here are some questions that you should ask yourself when analysing a source. There are 6 things that you want to look at there. Yeah, information. What's the meaning of the source? Yeah, what's the straight up meaning? What is it actually saying? The next one is, what is the implicit meaning? Yeah, so what is the meaning? What might the author be trying to convey that you've got to interpret that's not openly said in the words but is still part of the meaning? Yeah, there's 2 types of meaning there. There's the explicit and the implicit, or kind of implied. How does it agree with other stuff that you know from another source? So obviously you'd need to have seen some other sources there. So for example, even the Eddie Mabo speech we're going to look at today, we've looked at other sources such as a secondary source like the textbook. Does it agree with other information that you know? So how does this source either corroborate, agree with, or contradict, go against what you know from other sources? So there are 4 questions you want to ask when it comes to information. Simply enough, the origin, who created the source, what type of source is it, from what point of view is the source created, that's the perspective, yeah. Context, when was the source created, and what historical events happened at this time. So is when the source created important, and it usually will be. Audience, who was the intended audience of the source, and finally, what is the purpose of the source? So let's ask all those questions of the speech from Eddie Mabo. Right, so let's really quickly go through these questions to ask yourself when analysing a source as it applies to Eddie Mabo's speech. So I've just put a little screenshot of some of the info from that speech there on the right hand side. I'm not going to fully answer all these questions because we're going to get to that in some of the slides coming up. Okay, so first question, what's the explicit meaning of the source? The explicit meaning of the source, it's Eddie Mabo addressing a land rights conference that's held at a university in northern Queensland in Townsville. So it's Eddie Mabo outlining what he thinks land rights should be for people on Mer Island. That's the explicit, that's the what he actually says out loud. The implicit meaning of the source, what's implied there, I think that we'll see as we go through. What's implied is that Eddie Mabo is suggesting that the white people who came and took over tried to seem like that they're your friends, but actually they hand you the Bible with one hand and take your land away from the other. So I think the implied meaning there is that white settlers have been quite unfair to Indigenous people by taking away their land. How does that corroborate the information from another source? Everything else that I've read about this would definitely agree with this. Indigenous people certainly feel that they have been unfairly treated by settlers after having their land taken away. How much does it contradict information from other sources? I guess you could say there's a little bit of contradiction in the sense that before the land rights, before the development of Indigenous land rights became a big thing in the 90s, what Eddie Mabo is saying here does go against that legal doctrine of terra nullius, land belonging to no one. Eddie Mabo is saying, no, it isn't land belonging to no one, it's land belonging to these people. Here's the tribal divisions on Mer Island right there, and there's even the lists of last names and clans. So it contradicts information from pre-1981 sources. Who created the source? Eddie Mabo. What kind and type of source is it? It's a primary source. It's a speech, and this is the text of the speech. From what point of view is the source created? It's from an Indigenous man's point of view, an Indigenous land rights activist point of view. When was it created? It was created in 1981. The historical events happening at this time that are important to the creation of this source. So we see throughout the 60s and 70s a real awakening of Indigenous land rights movement. We saw the Gurindji Wave Hill walk-off. We saw the Bark petition. We saw the handing back of land by Gough Whitlam to Vincent Lingiari. So a real awakening, a real blossoming of the Indigenous rights movement. Yeah, really, this speech is really in the middle of that. The intended audience of the source. So originally it was just spoken to members of that conference, the Land Rights Conference, but obviously he knew that it was going to be written down and hopefully spread throughout the community. So the intended audience of the source, I would say legal land rights scholars, as well as possibly Australia more generally. But the direct audience was just the people who went to that land rights conference. And what was the why was the source made? Why did Eddie Mabo give this speech? Because, and this goes back to the implicit meaning of the source, because he wanted to outline the land rights and land use that had existed on Mer Island in the Torres Strait for many, many years. And he wanted to demonstrate that these land rights shouldn't have been cancelled out when white settlers came. So I guess he's trying to demonstrate the injustice of settlement and the negative impacts that that's had on land use for people in that island. Cool. That's just a very super quick summary. These are the kinds of things that you want to try to automate when you look at a historical source. Ask these questions: information, origin, perspective, context, audience, motive. Okay, so some text source analysis skills, and this is very similar to when we looked at analysing cartoons, but with texts instead. So, same as last time, one of the big skills is using your historical knowledge to help explain the source. So the lowest level of that is just listing info. Boom, a little bit of historical information you might know. The next level up is making sure that the info that you list is actually relevant. Okay, so you would be mentioning stuff about Mabo and land rights, not about the stolen generations, for example, if you're talking about this speech. The next level up is actually explaining the source using your knowledge. So maybe you've got some knowledge about the burgeoning land rights movement for Indigenous Australians, and you might mention that when explaining the source and placing it in its historical context. And the top level there, you've got a number of ideas, you've got a number of pieces of historical knowledge, and in your answer to a question about the speech, you're going to be able to put those ideas into different categories. You might have some about land rights, you might have some about the Indigenous movement overall, you might have some specifically about Torres Strait, you might have some about legal definitions of land rights. Yeah, they're different categories of ideas. Okay. The next skill is establishing the usefulness of the source. How useful is this source for historians to understand the past? So the bottom level, you're just listing stuff about the source. It's a speech from 1981 about land rights. The next level up, you're actually discussing the usefulness of the source. So you might say, yeah, it's a speech about land rights. It shows the point of view of a Torres Strait Islander, yada, yada, yada. The next level up, you don't just have one idea about how useful that source is to historians, you've got a number of different ideas. And the top level, not only do you have a number of different ideas about how useful that source is to historians, in the structure of your answer you're able to separate out the different types of aspects of usefulness. So you might say it's useful because it corroborates other sources, it's useful because it comes directly from an Indigenous person, or whatever you might. You've got different aspects, but you're not just rambling them, you separate them out structurally in your answer. So something like, firstly, blah, 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 secondly, blah, 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 thirdly, blah, blah, blah. That could happen. And the third relevant text source analysis skill I want to talk about today is determining the purpose of the source. Yeah, that was the last question, and those questions you should ask yourself. What is the purpose of the source? So the lowest level is just suggesting any old purpose. Not necessarily a correct one, but you actually have a go. The next level up is that you identify something that could be a reasonable purpose. Now, I do just want to make this warning now because this always happens. Sources from the past are not made for future historians to use to understand the past. That's very unlikely, yeah, right? So when you're looking at a medieval painting and you say, well, what was the purpose of that painting? The answer is not going to be to show people 200 years later what it was like in the past. Think about that. That's not generally what paintings are made for these days, and that's pretty much usually not what they were made for in the past, yeah? A painting in the past was made for a rich person to hang up on their wall and to show off. That's what a lot of medieval art was for, right? So the purpose that you identify needs to be reasonable, and I'm just telling you right now, it's very unlikely that a reasonable purpose for that historical source is going to be so that future historians can understand the past. That's just a byproduct. That's not going to be the reason why it was made at the time. Right. The next level up is you've got a reasonable purpose and you justify that with evidence from the source. Okay, so you might go, I reckon this is why this source was made, and then you actually point out some stuff in the source to back up your answer. Okay, let's get into it. We're going to read through most of Eddie Mabo's speech, and then we're going to have a go at answering some of these questions, and in the end you're going to pick one paragraph and do a little short analysis on it. Eddie Mabo, land rights in the Torres Straits. This is from his quote-unquote Okay, let's read the next bit. The struggle for land rights has been a major issue in Aboriginal and Islander politics for the last decade. Yeah, so there you go. He's referencing the historical context that he's in. It's interesting to note that our struggle for land rights has attracted so many of our fellow white Australians to join us. Some larger institutions, such as the churches and trade unions, have also made public announcements giving their support for Aboriginal and Islander land rights claims. However, it's extremely pleasing to see so many of our white friends here representing organisations in various professions giving us moral and professional support. So there you go. He mentions the fact that the struggle for Indigenous land rights claims does have popular support, not just amongst Indigenous people. Before I address you on the topic which I have been requested to speak on, I want to tell you that I will not be making reference to any books because what I know about my people and our culture did not come from books written by academics. My textbooks were my parents, especially my late mother and father, Maiga and Benny Mabo of Lass Village, a village in the Torres Strait Islands, and so many other people who contributed to my traditional education, and all my people of the Eastern Torres Strait Islands who unknowingly contributed to the knowledge I now have. So there you go, and he makes an interesting point there. He's referencing the fact that Indigenous culture is an oral culture, not a written culture. Indigenous history was passed from grandparents to parents to children, down to their children, and so on, rather than being written down in books. Right, let's try and apply one of our historical skills to these paragraphs. Establishing the usefulness of the source. How useful is this source for telling a historian, us, practicing historians, stuff about the past? So my first thing, the lowest level, you'd just be listing information about the source. It's from 1981 and is a speech given by an Indigenous man. There you go. Now I'm going to discuss the usefulness of the source. I might say it's a primary source written by an Indigenous activist, and so it gives us a great insight into the Indigenous perspective on land rights. So it is useful for a historian because it gets into the historical perspective of the person. Remember those big historical thinking concepts? One of them was historical perspectives, and here we are able to get the historical perspective of the land rights activists themselves, so that's useful. Next level up, we would mention a number of different aspects. So we might talk about the fact that it's an Indigenous person. One, he's a land rights activist. He places his this court case within the larger struggle for land rights. He also references the fact that Indigenous culture is an oral history, so all of that stuff would be useful. That's 4 different things, I think. And to get that top level, you use those different aspects, but you're going to separate them in your answer. You're going to structure it so you might so first, second, third, fourth, and you might separate it into different types. Okay, so you might have 1, historical information, and talk about the fact that Indigenous people had an oral history, and there's public support. And then another type of usefulness might be the fact that it's a primary source. It's a speech from the person involved. Yeah, they're different types of aspects. You've got the historical information, and you've got who gave the speech. Let's move on. Okay, in the Torres Strait, land ownership is the same throughout. It's different from Aboriginal land ownership on the mainland. Although we have tribal regions, we go much further into the clan area and then to individual or family holdings. The system existed as long as we could remember. When the first white men arrived in our islands, they found people as village dwellers who lived in permanent houses and in well-kept village. They also discovered that we were expert gardeners and hunters. So that paragraph points out that this belief that Indigenous people were only hunters and gatherers is not true. Yeah, they had permanent houses and they gardened. There you go, straight from the horse's mouth. I can see that lots of problems will be created if the Queensland government decides to de-reserve the existing reserves. So obviously part of Mer Island was an Indigenous reserve, so they were allowed to use the land, but the Queensland government was trying to end that, and that's why he's taking them to court. I want to make a proposal to all Queenslanders and the Queensland government. This proposal is based on several reasons. Torres Strait has been a lost paradise in the state and Commonwealth. Since the boom in plastics and decline of pearl and trochus industries, trochus is a type of shellfish, we've been the non-productive area of the state, and according to the State Department of Aboriginal and Island Advancement, we have been a liability to the state government. This is unmistakably true. It's a deliberate attempt to mislead the people of Queensland on how well we are looked after. Right, so let's have a go at applying that third historical skill to it, which is determining the purpose of the source. Handy paragraph to look at. So here's me suggesting a source. The lowest level is suggesting a source that's not reasonable. Eddie Mabo hates the government. That could be something you'd say about this speech. It's not very reasonable. He doesn't actually say that he hates the government. He just thinks they're mistaken. So a reasonable purpose might be, the purpose of this speech is for Eddie Mabo to highlight the reasons why he thinks that the Queensland government should not get rid of the existing reserves. Okay, so my reason for the purpose was because he's trying to highlight why the Queensland government is wrong to get rid of those reserves, and to justify it with evidence from the source, I would quote from the source. I would say, as you can see, Eddie Mabo mentions problems will be created, quote, if the Queensland government decides to de-reserve the existing reserves, unquote. Now remember, when you include quotes from texts, don't quote entire sentences, just quote bits of sentences that go within a sentence that you write. Awesome. So they are the three historical skills that we're trying to teach you, and we're just going to read a little bit more of the speech, and then you're going to have a chance to analyse some of it yourself. I myself and my colleagues at the Torres Strait Land Council failed to see any good reason for Torres Strait to remain as part of Queensland. Our wish for the area to be transferred to the Commonwealth has gradually caught on in the islands themselves. Problems associated with our well-being in the area of health, education, housing and industrial development are all lacking attention from the state. So here he's saying he wants his island, Mer Island, or it's called Murray Island as well, he wants it to be run by the Commonwealth. Yeah, Australia has a federal system, so there's state governments and then there's the federal or the Commonwealth government. Eddie here is saying that he wants his island to be managed by the Commonwealth, by the federal government, not by the Queensland government, because they haven't treated them very well. Whatever services are being provided are inadequate compared to the standards on the mainland. Education and health are the prime examples of Queensland's lack of interest in the area and its black people. This race will either die out or be made into zombies as a result of VD, which is a disease, a group of diseases, and lack of attempts to eliminate the disease. What we actually want is real help, not patronising colonial rule anymore, more advanced help from our prosperous white Queenslanders to enable us to stand on our own feet and be able to exercise our rights as Australians and members of the British Empire, as stated by Douglas at the time of annexation, which means seizing of land, of Torres Strait by Queensland. We do not want to remain as your poor neighbour anymore. The only real help we want from Queensland is to transfer the area to the Commonwealth, to be under the Department of Home Affairs and Department of Aboriginal Affairs for financial assistance. So there you go. A direct request. He stated very specifically what the purpose of his court case and speech is for. And in this final slide, there's a little bit more to the speech. We're just going to show this because the video has been quite long already. Here's just his 7 main points. Transfer the islands from the Queensland to Commonwealth Government. The Commonwealth Government then makes it an autonomous, a self-ruling region. Then we have an election. Then we write a constitution. Then we get people from the government to help us to write that constitution. Then they get their own rights over the fishing of the area. And we need financial assistance just to set ourselves up. So that's the 7 things that he wants to see happen. So hopefully from that big discussion, you got an idea about what the purpose of it is for, what historical knowledge would be relevant, and how useful it is as a historian. Our video today comes from the History Skills website. It's called How to Analyze a Historical Source. Take it away. Really quick reflection activity today. I want you, with the topic being analysing texts, summarise the idea of analysing text in exactly 12 words. Exactly. Awesome, it's homework time. Okay, here we go. Pick one paragraph from that manifesto. Now, there's a link right at the start of this video that shows you where it is, or you can just scroll back, pause the video and pick one paragraph, and I want you to have just a couple of sentences answering each of these three questions. What historical knowledge do you have that can help explain it? You can do this in dot point if you want, it's just a practice. How useful is it as a source of information about the past? And what is the purpose of the manifesto? I've answered all those questions in this video, so you just need to paraphrase what I've said. For those of you that are keen as beans, read chapter 4.11. It's about Eddie Mabo and his successful land rights court case that he brought against the Queensland government. Thank you so much for participating in this lesson, and as I always say, keep it real.